Okay, Trey, Star Wars is dying. Let's go ahead and take a look. Got your post up right here. I was just looking at your writing. This is your first time using InDesign. So that's cool. It's okay. InDesign is by no means difficult, but it is time consuming to learn, and there's a lot involved in InDesign. So being a first-time user, my recommendation is to take as many tutorials as you can and just keep taking tutorials throughout the class. Of course, you've got your required textbook reading, so that's really super important that you keep up with that. It's a big, shows you basic page setup. But as far as additional tutorials go, Megan has a really great suggestion down here, and she's given you links to a couple of outstanding tutorials. Thank you, Megan, very much. This is a outstanding response to Trey's post. So thank you for sharing this. Trey, this first one is, it's an Adobe site, and there's probably 40 tutorials on that page, and you can pick and choose, see what's pertinent for the projects associated with this class. And then down here is lynda.com. Now, if you haven't gotten into lynda.com yet, you have a free subscription along with your tuition at RimCAD. So you do have access to lynda.com. You definitely want to use that. This is a great title for establishing a magazine double spread layout design and multi-page layout. So this is a really great tutorial. I would definitely put both of these in your favorites and refer to these throughout the duration of the class. Again, lynda.com is second to none in tutorial quality and design advice. So you definitely want to get in there as being a brand new user to InDesign. Okay, let's go ahead and jump over to your work. All right, now that's a great start. Really good job. Good start. I think your typesetting is set up pretty good for somebody who's just beginning. So we've got a few tips and a few pointers. A lot of it has to do with hierarchy, and a lot of it, and then we'll get down into typography. So right now we've got this view based on looking at the double page spread, so we can take a look at hierarchy. And I think the hierarchy is could be improved in this page. And the reason I say that is because there's no real focal point. I say there's no real focal point because there's basically two focal points. This illustration and this illustration are both competing for attention. Now, an illustration on a page, of course, is going to be the first thing that a viewer looks at. So you can scale your illustrations based on the fact that you know the viewer is going to look at the illustrations first before they look at anything else. So in that regard, I would say decide which one is more important. Which one do you want the viewer to look at first, and then reduce the size of the other one and reformat the composition accordingly. The problem right now is both of these images are both equally saying, hey, this image over here is saying, hey, look at me first, and this one's over here saying, no, look at me first. And that's all based on the fact that they're both presented pretty large in the composition. So work with scale to enhance hierarchy in your illustrations, in the visual aspect of the design itself. Next thing we want to talk about is the expeditious use of white space. So white space is a design element and can be used as such. White space helps, it makes the article much more inviting in that the viewer isn't confronted with the situation where they open up a page and they see typography and visual elements forced to all four corners and all four sides of the page. And that's very much what we see here. We don't have a whole lot of white space here. So this layout appears to be somewhat daunting to the viewer and may even dissuade the viewer from coming in here and reading this. I'll show you a couple of things we can do to make it a little bit more inviting. Now, as far as the type itself goes, the main thing I'm seeing here, of course, is that the big blue background, and I do not recommend that. And the reason I don't recommend is you're kind of creating frames on each of the pages. So what that does basically is it boxes the page in. So it's not, this page doesn't have, it's not being allowed a good, healthy working relationship with this page because they're both kind of boxed in and squished in. They don't have a working relationship with the outside world because, again, they're both just confined in these boxes. And it's very confining, and I think the viewer very much gathers that confining sensation, and it creates an uncomfortable visual tension. Again, I recommend removing the color background and just presenting your type on the page color white. The grid use, I think, is something that's a little bit inconsistent here. So here's the grid. I have set up the grid. Remember in that demonstration, I had set up the grid. So we have 2 pages, 4 columns each page. Now what you've done here is you've used this to create a 2-column, a 2-column text column. It's a 4-column grid, each of the 2 text columns using 2 columns of grid. right? But we see that here and here. The problem is the grid is uneven. So right now we can see this is the left page of the grid, right? So here's the center line. This is called the alley, aka the gutter. This is also called the page gutter, the center line. But the sections that are in between the grid columns are called alleys. Now you've got yours set up as a 2-column grid on each side, right? So basically you should be using that center alley as your guide. So your type should fall within this grid right here. Let me just grab. So your type for this column could fall right here, okay? And as you can see, this would be an equal space width for the illustration. So we wouldn't have this real wide illustration and then this narrow type column, which would not conform to the grid, as we can see right there. Okay, and then over here we see the same thing. This grid is a lot wider. This column of type is a lot wider than this column. So again, that's a little bit of a problem. So we want to even out those type columns. The next thing I would say is that there's just so much type here. A couple of things we can do is, you don't have to include all of this type in all of the text in this particular layout. You can always come down here and say continued on page, so-and-so, and then you can eliminate a lot of this text. So don't feel like you have to fit all of this type within this layout. Right over here, as I said, I think there's a lot of ways, a lot of things that we can do here. I want to show you the same page setup. This is actually the same page setup that we are using, in that this is a single page, but here's your 2 columns. Here's your center alley, column, 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 column. So there's 4 columns. And this is a lot more easy to digest because there's a lot of use of white space, right? So you've got the headline area, which uses white space, so stuff's not jammed all the way up to the corner of the margins. Then you've got over here, you've got the headline, and then note the type starts right under the headline. I would pull the type down, start it down here, and add a subhead right here. So you've got elements of a page. You could add a subhead and even call that deck head or an intro kicker. This is it right here. And it's just a little paragraph that would describe the headline and segue into the story. It's usually presented in a typeface that's a little larger than the body copy for the actual, for the font used for the actual body copy. So you could say something like this: why is Star Wars dying? Then give us a subhead, and then you could even give us a paragraph or a few sentences in a larger font, describing the story, introducing the story. Then when you introduce the actual story, consider a drop cap. That's a really great technique. And then that tells your viewer the story begins here. Here's where you want to look. Okay, your type setting is pretty good. I do think your font size is very, very small. For this 11 by 17 to 8.5 by 11 pages side by side, I would say you don't want to go. I'd say maybe 10 to 12 point. This probably is 10, maybe even less right here, but this is probably 6 or 8. This is really, really tiny, tiny type. I don't recommend that. I'd say type size for this particular spread would be anywhere between 10 and 12 points. Okay, so at that point, I think your typeset looks pretty good. You got a couple of typographic widows right there. And I believe there was another one. I can't see it offline. A typographic widow is something that starts, a word that rests on a line alone. So that's a typographic. You don't want that. Another major thing I'm seeing here is this type is different than this type. It's a different scale. So this is larger than this. So you want uniform type. Consider a typographic variety by introducing a sans serif. So a really neat technique is to use, like, if you could use a sans serif for the headline, and then maybe a serif for the subhead and the deck head, and then back to a sans serif for body copy. But it's really interesting to add a typographic variety by adding a second family. So if you have, right now all you have is sans serif, so I would recommend adding a serif in here somewhere for typographic variety. A couple other techniques. So yeah, and try to work on the headline area to be a little bit more inviting. And here's a great example right here. And then you've got the drop cap, and note you've got these little subheads. So you could introduce these little subheads. This looks like a little subhead right here, but it's not treated with any different typographic hierarchy than, oh, I can't select that guy right there. So you would want to, and I noticed that's the only subhead. So if you want to introduce subheads, that's a really great way. Another thing to separate the text is a call out. This is a call out right here. And it's a quote or even just a section of text that is kind of highlighted and presented a little bit larger. And it serves as a break. It serves to break up the text a little bit, act as kind of a resting spot, and just a kind of a breather for the viewer. So again, in summary, I'd say let's start to use a white space a little bit more expeditiously. Even out your columns for your grid. Try to establish a solid focal point using scale based on the illustrations. Introduce captions to the illustrations. Headline, let's introduce a subhead and a deck head, which is that introduction. Drop cap for the first intro, the first letter for the first word in the first paragraph. You can use a continued on page, so you don't have to use all of this text in the layout. And then just try to establish a call out and maybe some of these other techniques to break the page up a little bit. Okay, so that is really all I want to cover right now. I think that gives you enough to work on, but I think the main thing is really working on white space and the expeditious presentation of the information in a way that it doesn't look like it's just so jumbled up in the page. And the name of the game at this point, Trey, is getting out there and taking a look at magazines, taking a look, get out there and do some visual research. I typically look at, like if I'm setting up a magazine spread, I'll look at 50 or 60 magazine spreads out in my visual research. So I think the name of the game right now is get out there and really start studying different magazine spreads specifically for columns of type and using the same configuration that we have set up for this assignment, and just get some ideas on how to set up. And then of course, just keep taking those InDesign tutorials from lynda.com and some of that other resource as well that Megan had posted in response to your work. All right, Trey, I know I gave you a lot to think about here, and that's okay. We start with the basics in typography. We really start with the basics. So instead of getting into a lot of minute typographic things, we really want to set up the basic foundation first, and then we can establish the rest from there. Okay, hope that makes sense. Hope my comments make sense. Please consider adding as many of the elements I suggested. And also, if you have any questions, comments, concerns at all, or if you need any clarification whatsoever, please get with me. I'll be glad to answer any questions that might have to come up. Thank you very much, Trey. Great start. Looking forward to seeing this one proceed into a complete and a complete artifact. All right. Great job. Thank you so much, Trey.